Okay, I guess first while we're waiting for everyone else to show up, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why, but for some reason the camera decided not to work today. No great loss on your part, but okay. I guess we'll start. Oh, wait. Oh. Okay. You should be able to see this image. And this is actually sort of central to understanding how things worked here, especially in the early 19th century, but also to a certain extent, why the Big Island falls off the chart. Now, this is sort of one of those Wednesdays, since this is the middle of the week, trick questions. If you're looking at these big sailing ships, these are sort of like the ultimate Uber sailing ship, the Tea Clippers. How do they get around? What do they need to get from point A to point B?
Wind.
Wind.
Yeah, okay, good, see? Okay. You have to remember, till the 1840s, 1850s, ships didn't have motors. Motors didn't exist. So these things are entirely on the mercy of the wind. The wind gets them to some place and the wind gets them off a place. There's all sorts of sayings that you don't hear too much in the United States, but you still hear a lot appearing in England. And one of them is what they call on a lee shore, which means basically that you've got a ship that's powered by wind and it's trapped in a situation where it's on the wrong side of a cliff, so there's no wind getting to it and the waves are pushing it into the rocks. In that situation, all you can do is pray. These guys have no way to get anywhere unless they've got wind power. If you ever want to watch this in a actually pretty good movie, that's sort of a good example of this period, there's a movie called Master and Commander from about, I think, about 10 years ago, which really gives you a good sense for what it was like to be sailing in the Pacific in this period. So sort of visualize, keep this sort of that image in mind. Now, if I thought this would come here. There we go. The Big Island is the spot where initially Europeans have to show up, and that's because the Big Island chiefs in the late 17 or the 1800s, of course, were the dominant political military force in the islands. So what you were going to do is you're going to go over there and PR them. First Cam's dad, and then Kamehameha himself, who are based on this side down here, with their headquarters basically down here at Kealakekua. Now, the problem from a sailing standpoint, again, so you got to visualize, for Polynesian voyaging canoes, it's a different thing. Polynesian canoes use different types of sails. They have an ability to go different directions in a different way. And of course, they were much smaller. You're generally talking between 30 and 70 feet. They had large crews of paddlers. So basically, they had a human-powered engine. If you're thinking of those big sailing ships we're looking at, I don't care how many guys you stick out the side of them, they're just going to be splashing water. It's going to be like little kids. They're not going to be able to move that thing at all. So basically, unlike their Polynesian or Hawaiian counterparts, the European vessels are entirely at the mercy of winds. Now, if you visualize for a second the normal wind system here, it's blowing this way. It's coming out of the east, northeast. It's blowing across the island. Now, especially because, again, the Big Island with continental climate doesn't even have those winds as persistently. So if it's the other islands, you can pretty much guarantee if you're on the southwest side that winds are going to come off the mountains and you're still going to have wind. The Big Island, it's very common if you're in Kailua Kona for the wind to just shut down and you've got no wind at all, which means if you're one of these European or American ships, you're just going to sit there. You're not going anywhere in a hurry. Now, what this meant is right from the get-go, in fact, Cook even complains about this in his first voyage here, is that, or I should say his only voyage since he doesn't make it out, is when he comes down into here is basically he's in what we call one of these lee shores. So if you're one of these sailing ships and you sail over the Big Island from basically here all the way down to here, you've got no way to get around unless the winds up, you end up with sort of random winds. You don't have any guaranteed winds. And in these ships, you need guaranteed winds because you have to remember the other big deal until the, mid late 19th century. There's no such thing as Coast Guard. There's no such thing as rescue services. If if you end up aground, you're screwed. I mean, it's that simple. There's no rescue services. There's no one that's going to help you. In fact, until the 1830s, 1840s, it might be a year or two before anyone even knows you've disappeared. So for European American ships dealing with the Hawaiian Islands, they have to be incredibly paranoid about the wind conditions and the sea conditions and just everything about the place, because if they screw it up, whether it's their fault or whether they just gambled and the winds didn't show up or whatever it is, they're dead, literally. So they're not in a situation, I think we tend to think of nowadays, my boat, for example, has VHF, it has GPS systems, it has all sorts of stuff on it. Basically, with one button, you can immediately contact 3 different groups and say help. These guys don't have anything. Their nearest help is 7,000 miles away in either New England or 12,000 miles away in London. So they've got nothing. So they're on their own totally. The closest parallel would be if you're on, if you're some group living on Mars or the moon or something like that. You ain't got nobody. So in that context, one of the things you're going to be very, very careful of is you got to save the boat. You got to make sure you're in conditions where you can get where you want and get out easily. And the Big Island just didn't have those. In this period of time, this side, the Hilo side, had no good harbors. Hilo is a terrible harbor, especially if you visualize winds and surf coming in here. The winds and surf come in here. In fact, if you ever go to Hilo, you'll notice the surf comes just rocketing into the harbor. So if you're a European or American boat and you come in here, you might have a lot of wind, but the wind's blowing you into the rocks and you can't get out. If you go on this side of the island and you try to camp out here, you can't get in very easily. And if you get in, you might not be able to get out because of the winds again. So the Big Island, one, has no good harbors naturally. And two, the way the island's just set up is a nightmare for European type sailing vessels. Now, what this means is right from the get-go, if you're the initial explorers or something like that, you'll take your chances because you're the first guys on the spot. If you have to until maybe about 1810, 1815, you'll go here to Kauai, or actually go here to Kealakekua, simply because that's where the high chiefs are. And if you don't get them on your side, they're going to take your ship. So you don't have any choice. It doesn't matter how dangerous it is. It's going to be more dangerous if you don't PR these guys. The minute that calms down, the minute the Kamehameha gets control of the islands and sets up the monarchy, at that point, all of a sudden, the European interest in coming to this island just disappears because they pretty much tell him that they can't do that. It's too risky. It's not worth it. And especially if you're a trader, if you're a whaling ship or a trading ship or something like that, your entire life and your fortune is based on the ship. You're not an explorer. No one's going to, pay to rescue you or something like that. They're just going to be all pissed off because you lost all the money. So in that situation, these guys are going to minimize their risk. And minimizing risk in the Hawaiian Islands meant that you went to one of 2 places. The best harbor, in fact, the best harbor in the Hawaiian Islands is actually right here, and it's not even a harbor. It's called Lahaina Roads. It's this area off of Lahaina. It's only about 20 to 40 feet deep in water. It's got a sand bottom, so you can throw one of those old style anchors in there. The anchor holds almost all the time. You're protected by the mountains from heavy winds, but there's always persistent winds coming off the channel. So you literally can sail in one of those big sailing boats that we saw in the images. You come in here, you literally just slow down, drop your sails, drop your anchor, bang, and you're parked. When you want to get out, you just pull up the sails, pull up the anchor, and boom, and out you go. So it's sort of like going through McDonald's drive-in. It's absolutely painless. And so the Europeans made it very clear from the get-go, this is where they were going to go because it was safe, it was easy for them. You have to remember another thing at the period of time is if you were a captain of a ship, you sailed a ship, there was no test that you took. You didn't have some sort of certification. In many cases, you just had the money, you owned the ship. So it'd be sort of like if someone, buys a car here and they get to drive the car anywhere they want just because they bought it. So there'd be no driver's license, there'd be no test. Given how quality some of the driving around here, I think that's probably the case anyways. But in this period, there was no skill set that was required to sail a boat. So a lot of these guys were really crappy at it. And if you actually look at your Thrum's first volume at the maritime stuff, He has all this list of incidents, and the number of times you hear of guys just literally sailing into like Honolulu Harbor and just crashing into everything because they can't figure out how to stop their boat. And you're sort of thinking like, Jesus, what the hell? Until you realize, they literally learned on the job, and some of them learned better than others. Some were stupider than a post, and that's just the reality of it. So Lahaina very quickly becomes the spot where ships come in, because if you don't have a motor, this is the safest place in the Hawaiian Islands to get to. If for some reason you want to go to a place and fix stuff, since that's, basically open ocean, you come into Honolulu Harbor, which has the advantage that it's protected and you can actually run a boat aground and then fix it and, patch it up and then sail it back out. But it's not near as good of a place to sail in and out of as Lahaina. So by the 1820s, what you find is the Europeans coming into Hawaii invariably park here and then completely ignore the Big Island. Once they convince the government, the Hawaiian government, that this is the place to be, then not surprisingly, very quickly, by I think 1823, the Hawaiian government moves its headquarters to Lahaina. And at that point, the Big Island just completely falls off the chart. It just ceases to be relevant. It's too hard for the European ships to get in and out of. That means that the European trade isn't going to happen. That means the high chiefs are all going to leave because all the money and all the stuff and all the good times are happening somewhere else in Lahaina initially, later Honolulu. And so the Big Island just goes poof, and it just literally, almost vanishes, sort of like out of sight, out of mind. And it doesn't really recover that until the late 20th century. The only thing, ironically, that keeps it alive is the absolute fascination that the Europeans have with checking out the volcano, i.e. Kilauea. That's the only thing that keeps any traffic coming to the Big Island. If you're Europeans, the Wilkes expedition in 1843 that comes here, lands in Honolulu, lands in Lahaina, does all their business there, and then when they're leaving, they stop in the Big Island at Kealakekua, and all the crew, including the captain, march up to check the volcano out, just because you got to see it. So it's sort of like on the bucket list. If you were in the Hawaiian Islands, you had to check the volcano out, but there was nothing else in the Big Island that was interesting or relevant. And of course, from an economic point of view, the Big Island isn't going to offer the traders or anything like that any reason to come there. So the Big Island basically just sort of gets frozen out. As the Hawaiian population decreases, especially because if you mentioned what I mentioned, I think a couple of weeks ago, as you get the grazing animals coming in and destroying the dryland agricultural system, the population just vanishes, and a large number of folks on the Big Island move to the other islands. They don't necessarily die; they just get the hell out of town because there's nothing left on the Big Island for them, and there's not really the resources. And again, if you want money, if you want a job, you want to get education, you have to go to Maui because that's Lahaina School. That's the first school. That's where the whaling ships are. That's where the Europeans are. That's where the money's at. So the Big Island pretty much becomes for lack of a better term, just a rural backwater. And one of the side effects of that is, even though you've got this enormous piece of real estate, is from basically 1820 through, I don't know, maybe 1960. The Big Island is just not relevant. It might be really, really big, but it's also really, really absent. And so what you get is the Big Island sort of is not in the system. Now, this has pluses and minuses. Among other things, it means that with the exception of your plantations, for example, in the northeast section here in Kohala, a lot of the Big Island is left in the ranches that basically start up in the early monarchy period. So basically, this whole chunk of the Big Island from here all the way down through here, so basically almost a half of the island was in ranches. On Parker Ranch for a period of time until I think the 1950s was actually the largest family-owned ranch in the entire United States, which is sort of mind-blowing when you think of like Wyoming, Montana, Texas, Oklahoma, these huge ranches, and the Parker Ranch was the biggest, which says something about how off the charts the Big Island was. So in that context, it's important to remember that the Big Island basically runs into the problem that the technology of the early 19th century just meant that it was not an attractive location for people, especially the European context. Now, I actually see this in 1821, a guy named Ellis, who's actually with the London Missionary Society in Tahiti, comes up here. The missionaries had just arrived here in Hawaii in 1821. They immediately contact their counterparts in Tahiti and asked for them to send up a couple of guys that know Tahitian really well and have already started to try to translate stuff to help them figure out how to translate, how to turn Hawaiian into a written language first. And then secondly, how to translate English into Hawaiian in terms of the Bible and such. And so Ellis comes up from Tahiti. He's done the same work down there. He comes up here and he not only is responsible in large part for setting up the language, the written form of Hawaiian is in large part his work. But also what he does in 1822 to 1823, he actually walks around the Big Island. He takes like a 3-month, I don't know if not a vacation, I don't know what you'd call it. He walks around the island, and we've got this great record that he does of having walked around the entire island of what he sees every place he goes. The one thing that really struck him was that he had never been here before. He had heard stories from the earlier accounts of these huge field systems with all these people. Cook talks about this, Vancouver, everyone talked about it. When he arrives here in 1823, he doesn't see it. He says that he can see what's left of the field systems, the mounds of rocks going for miles and, here and there little bits of plants and stuff, but there's no people and there's no plants. He sees grazing animals, largely cattle and goats. And here, even at that point, he points out the cattle and the goats have destroyed the field system. So ironically, it's like another 80 or 100 years before the, geographers and climatologists actually realized he was right. So he notices that. And the other thing he notices, especially when he's walking around the Kona side of the island, is he literally would walk into ghost towns. He'd walk into villages where the structures are still there. You can see that there were people there, relatively recently, and they're entirely abandoned. And he's just amazed at the fact that he goes from village to village and there's either no one there or just a few people. And yet, it's obvious within, say, the last 10 years, they've been much larger populations. And he points out, at least in his view, a lot of that is due to the fact that the food system, the field systems have collapsed. So we actually have this great record of the fact that the Big Island becomes just massively depopulated. Now, the interesting thing is he doesn't see bodies. And when he's talking to people, he doesn't hear a lot about disease. So despite the current sort of spin, which is, the Europeans kill everyone from disease, what Ellis sees in 1823 is a disease-related thing. It's an environmental catastrophe. And an environmental catastrophe drives people out. They're not dying of starvation. They're not dying of, cholera or something like that in the Big Island. They're literally getting their butts off the island because there's nothing there for them. And that's what he sees. And there'd be no reason for him to spin that because, he wasn't even based here. When he's done with this, he takes a boat, goes back down to Tahiti. So what he sees on the Big Island is massive depopulation due to changing environmental conditions, due to the introduction of European grazing, Euro-American grazing animals, and the collapse of the agricultural system. Now you have to remember, compared to the other islands aren't going to have the same impacts, even though they get the grazing animals, because a wet field system like Aloi, you're not going to see cattle and even goats in that because they won't go into that because the water rots their hooves and will kill them. So if you have a wet field system like you've got in East Maui or say Palolo Valley here, you're not going to have grazing animals eating the crops because it's a wet field system and they're going to stay away from it. It was the Big Island, which only pretty much had dry field systems, that is so incredibly vulnerable to this European, thing that the monarchy brings in, or I should say Kamehameha brings in, and then the monarchy encourages the idea of ranching as a way for the government to make money. This basically destroys the Big Island, which is sort of ironic because, of course, that's Kamehameha's power base. So in generating the revenue he needs to buy guns and the other things, the Europeans have that he wants, he basically destroys the world that he grew up in. And then as a high chief, the world that he was responsible for. It's the Big Island people that he was in charge of. And he, for whatever calculated reasons, they get slapped, they get tanked. And that's not a European thing. It's a conscious move by the Kamehameha family for their sort of personal and family needs. Let's see the next one here. Now what that means is sort of an interesting way is if you look at the Big Island right into the 1980s, actually. What you find is in a lot of the Big Island, especially the leeward side, the Kona side, and this would include Kohala, is you find that a ranching industry that starts up in the 1820s, 1830s. So the monarchy very quickly gets out of directly being in charge of ranching. And what they do is they basically give people large plots of property and they become the ranchers and then they pay taxes to the monarchy. So the ranching industry starts in the Hawaiian Islands, actually starts first in the Big Island. And because there's no other pressures taking place, there's no movement to plantations in most of the island. There's not major population increases. In fact, there's major population decreases. So because you don't have the plantation systems, that also means you don't have large numbers of immigrants coming in from Asia in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and on. So you don't end up with the same population increases that so dramatically change the other islands. And so the end result of all that is that the ranching industry pretty much not only remains dominant for a large part of the island, but it's in many ways almost like a ranching industry that looks like something out of the 1830s. It doesn't have to, for example, you have ranches on Maui, Lupalakua, Halakala, a bunch of ranches on East Maui. But the thing is, they're competing with this large agribusiness system, Maui Land and Pine, sugar plantations, Pioneer Mill, the whole thing. And so they're part of a much more complex economic series of things, and they're all competing for water, for resources, and everything. On the big end, that just doesn't happen. If you're Parker Ranch, it's, the large chunk of the island is basically your playground. And so you don't have these economic pressures, which also means, in sort of a weird way, you can be sort of sloppy in how you do stuff because you don't really have any competition. You can pretty much go and you can be there for like 80 years and someone says, should we change this? And you go, well, no, we never had to do that way before. I think we'll just stay with the way that we're comfortable with. So you get this sort of mindset that you can do business the way you've done it because you've done it for 100 years. We did work, one of our field schools about almost 15 years ago. We did it at Kipukai Ranch. All right, sorry, it's not Kipukai, that's on Maui, that's on Kauai. I can't remember the name of the ranch right now. I'm over on the Big Island. And the ranch owner was fourth generation. A very nice lady, very sharp. Her office, she actually had her offices here in Honolulu. But the ranch had been in the family hands since 1842. So it actually predated the Mahele. And they had, they formally got the land during the Mahele. And when you would ask her, well, why do you run cattle this way or why do you do this that way? The answer you almost always get, well, my grandpa, my great grandpa did that and it works, so why should we change? So what you had was this very sort of institutionalized way of doing stuff that was based on the fact that it worked. But it wasn't necessarily based on the fact that it was the most economic or the most, in some cases, not even particularly logical way of doing stuff. And you could get away with it because you basically had almost no competition. As long as you just wanted to sell meat and you wanted to do that on your land, you pretty much didn't have any reason that you had to change anything. So the ranching industry is sort of interesting here, one, because it becomes highly conservative quickly in terms of sort of mindset. Secondly, because it's, pretty much first off the bat, if you're Hawaiian in the early, first half of the 19th century, and you sort of want to get involved in a cash economy, so you want to have some money, but you don't want to live in the cities, you don't want to deal with sort of, the howling influx of, especially American interest in the urban environments and stuff. So you still want to sort of stay close to your Hawaiian heritage, but you want to do it in a place where you're not, like Mililii, where you just basically get off the charts. The ranches were how you did that. So what you find is the ranching industry, right from the get-go, but right into actually right now, even till today, is largely dominated by Hawaiian or part Hawaiians. Almost all your Paniolos and almost all the ranches will be Hawaiian or part Hawaiian, whether it be the Purdy's or the other families, you see, depending on which ranch it is. And so what they end up later being usually Hawaiian Chinese. But you still find if you go to most of the ranches, the ranch hands still speak true Pidgin. They still see themselves as sort of purveyors of Hawaiian culture, Hawaiian values. And they see themselves as being radically different than the folks in other parts of the islands who they see as much more sort of westernized or Americanized or modernized. So the ranches, ironically, which are one of the big factors of change, by the latter half of the 19th century, started to see themselves as one of the last remaining bastions of sort of a Hawaiian-based society in a westernized world. And that's very much how the ranches still see themselves today. A lot of the ranches are they don't make a lot of noise about it, but they're very, very aggro about the fact that they actually reflect an older set of values that predates the plantation and has a different way of looking at stuff. And in many cases, the plantation owners, like the Parkers, or actually, I can't what the guy's name was, starts with an S, actually see themselves almost as being at ease. They see themselves as sort of being like a 19th or 20th or 21st century incarnation of a chief, and they treat the workforce in the way that a chief would treat, say, the Maka Island. So it's really interesting when we look at the ranches because they're part of a very different lifestyle and mental attitude than you see in the rest of the islands, which is one reason why they've probably never been heavily involved at all in the tourism industry. They're just not. They don't see it. There's not a fit there pretty much at all, with the exception of some spots on Maui. One of the other things that happens if you got a ranch, um, you don't nearly need a lot of roads, because what you do is you're chasing cows all over the place. And of course, what cows need is space. And so what you get is dirt roads, and that's fine because you're chasing cows with horses. Now you chase cows with ATVs, but it's sort of the same thing. A dirt bike or an ATV doesn't need a paved road either. So because the Big Island falls off the chart economically, because the Big Island falls off the chart in terms of almost everything, what you find is there's no when we become even the monarchy period, but even more importantly, we become a territory in 1900. The government's not going to spend any money putting roads or railways or anything in the Big Island because there's not enough people there, one, to make it worth their while. Two, there's no economic reason to do it. It's not like you build a road, you're going to suddenly increase the economic, potential for the region. And three is just the fact that it's such a big island that you have to put in a hell of a long road to get, to attach some places together. So, the size of the Big Island being what it is sort of mind blowing. You realize there's basically only one road around the island. Compared to, say, Oahu, where you got roads all over the place, or even Maui, pretty much got a lot of roads. Big Island, roads are few and far between, and most of the roads that you see now have been put up in the last 20 or 30 years. So what happens is the infrastructure development doesn't take place. As we'll see, this occurs in things like energy too, which becomes a huge nightmare in the last 40 years. So the Big Island just doesn't get a lot of investment. No one spends a lot of money improving the Big Island or keeping the Big Island up to date. And the population left on the Big Island doesn't necessarily like that. But on the other hand, you have to remember that at some point, I'd say by the late 19th century, the folks on the Big Island sort of get used to the idea, one, that say government, later the territory, and later the state really don't care about them. And to a certain extent, what you get is a pre-selection that if you live on the Big Island, you don't want the government to care about you. You sort of get what I call maybe the Alaska attitude. You don't really want to have much to do with government, so you find a place where the government isn't very visible, and the Big Island becomes the exemplar there, even more so than say Kauai. The government just isn't a part of the system there, and the folks on the Big Island don't necessarily like it all the time, but on the other hand, they've gotten used to doing their own thing, and so they don't see themselves necessarily as being part of the territory of Hawaii and the state of Hawaii. In terms of an integrated system, they sort of see themselves as the stepchild of it all. And you get this a lot when you talk to folks in the Big Island. They get hit by a hurricane, it's like, yeah, the state finally decided to do something about it. They end up with, other things like, I don't know about the state. If you notice yesterday, Kim, the Big Island mayor, decided they're not going to get involved in the tourism realty. That's very typical of the Big Island. They figure the state's not going to do them any favors. So unless they see some value to it, they're just going to tell the state, blow it out your ear. And that's actually reflective of this whole ranching environment and the sailing ships of the early 19th century. The Big Island just, sort of gets shunted off to the side, I guess, to a certain extent. And that develops a different mental attitude of sort of independence too. Now, let's take a look. Let's go back to this. Now, the only place that actually builds up and gets developed is Hilo. So let's see if I can finish this up. I'm having to do this in the classroom, so everything's not as accessible as usual. I know I did this stuff. switch the share to this one, if it'll work. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you guys see this picture?
Yep. Yeah, I can see
Okay.
it.
This is what we call an inter-island steamer. You guys have grown up, of course, in a generation where you've got inter-island airplanes. The only thing that goes by boat would be the young brother barges inter-island, and that's only if they decide to stay in business later this year. But the way that everyone got around prior to that was in these inter-island steamers. Now, initially, these were sailboats. So they were sailing boats just like the Europeans were going to Hawaii from the mainland from. But these were basically, went back and forth between the islands. And so this is literally how you got around. Now, in the other islands, you have harbors. In Lahaina side, you had Lahaina Harbor at Mala Wharf. And you also had, to a lesser extent, Kahului early on. Honolulu, of course, was Honolulu. There was Kaneohe. There was Ka'ava. There were a bunch of harbors in the Honolulu side. Not, of course, Pearl Locks being another one. Even Kauai already had no Wili Wili. And, of course, down in Poipu. So all the islands had decent harbors that these things could come and tie up, or at least in this case, it's dropped anchor. This is actually a picture from the Big Island. Now, if we'll say that I'm going to move house from Honolulu to Kona, Kailua Kona town, and it's in 1905, and that's like probably about the period of this video or this image. How am I moving my stuff off the boat? How do I get my stuff to shore? You see it right in front of the big boat. What's that white thing in front of the big boat? This is a Wednesday trick question. I'm sorry?
Is it a smaller boat?
Yeah, it's a little rowboat. That's how you get stuff. You literally climb your butt down a ladder, you take your stuff, you dump it in the boat, and someone rows you to shore. And of course, then you literally have to jump in the water, and someone has to unload your stuff off into the water, and then takes it to shore. Then they row back out, and they do the thing over again. So as you can imagine, shipping stuff to the Big Island was insane, because not only did almost all of it get water damage, but it was just a real pain in the ass. It was incredibly expensive, so you just didn't do it. Now it gets even goofier. Let's see if I can find a picture here. And much of the Big Island, you've got sea cliffs and you have no harbors. So this is how you get from land to the boat in a lot of the Big Island. How are they getting from the land down to that boat? I'll give you a hint. They're not using little white boat there. That little white boat's actually a rescue boat. Nowadays, this would be seen as a form of recreation, probably sort of an extreme sport range. Okay, this picture is being taken from a cliff. You literally go on that wire down to the boat. So you zip line down to the boat. If you want to bring people ashore, you actually take one of those other lines. You have a person tied to a buoy down there, or tied to a hanging system down there, and a seat. And you literally have people ashore, and they literally pull them up that line till they get to shore. If you've got cargo, you do the same thing. You literally pull it up that line to shore, which you can imagine is a really good way to build your upper body strength. Now, what happens if it gets rough out there? If all of a sudden we're now in 6 to 10 foot seas? So all of a sudden it's bouncing up and down. You have two choices. Either you don't go ashore, or you go boingy, boingy, boingy all the way up this thing, or boingy, boingy all the way down, and then hope that you don't slam into the boat when you hit the bottom. Or you don't fall in the ocean, which is why this little boat's here. It's to rescue people and stuff that fall off of this line. That's the only way you get ashore. There's no other way to do it. About half of the Big Island, this is how you got ashore. And Na'alehu, for example, this is the way they were doing it right in the 1940s. So let me show another one here. Let's see, where's the other one? I can't find the other one. There's actually one where they're unloading the cattle, which is hilarious. I mean, you literally would take that same system, you just fire the cattle, they fire the cattle down that thing in a sling, and you yank the thing, and all of a sudden, right when they get near the ocean, the cattle are dropped out of the sling, they just literally fall in the water. And then you see guys in the water just trying to grab the cattle and haul their ass to the boat where they can put a line on them and like haul them into the boat, which of course, I actually point out that in many cases, the cattle die of heart attacks. And that's how even if you had a ranch, that's how you got your cattle onto the boat so that you could sell them. Now, on the more sophisticated islands, you had piers. So you can just avoid all this stuff. Here's your inter-island steamer. It has little rowboats that come in. People get here, they stay on dry land, they get out to the boat, and they're good to go. You don't have to use that bizarre system of wires and stuff like that. I don't know of anywhere else in the world they did that except here. And it's pretty much only on the Big Island, which means even more so, if people are going to go check the place out, they're going to think twice about when they say, oh, okay, I need to get ashore. And the guy goes, well, okay, you're going to have to wait a couple hours till the sea conditions get a little better, and then we're going to zip you up to the shore. And you have to remember, you're going maybe 150 feet up the side of a cliff in not necessarily good weather, so you're bouncing up and down. If you tried to do that as some sort of modern zip line thing for tourists, the state would sue your ass. They wouldn't even let you think about doing something as stupid as that. And not to mention anyone would be dumb enough to actually do it. So, I mean, the Big Island that was the way things were done on the Big Island. And it just meant that a lot of stuff just didn't happen. So a lot of the Big Island essentially was between the fact that they had no roads, they had no railway, and they really had no ship access. Even if you wanted to start up a business on a lot of the parts of the Big Island, you couldn't, because you couldn't get your stuff to market. How would you sell it? For example, that thing with the wires down to the boat, that was mainly used in places like Na'alehu for shipping coffee. Because coffee, it's in a bag, it doesn't give a crap. So you just sit there and just fire it down to the boat, and eventually when you're all full or you're all done, then it's all done. But they used to have huge problems in shipping food off the boat back up to the coffee farms. So, the Big Island, basically, you could have spent millions and millions and millions of dollars maybe putting in protected harbors, but it wasn't worth it. And so they just didn't. Now, the only place that then avoids that is Hilo. And again, since it's Wednesday, I'm asking you guys a bunch of questions. Why does Hilo end up on the charts? I'll give you a hint. It has nothing to do with Hilo per se. It has to do with something that's relatively close to Hilo. In fact, this was the first paved road on the Big Island. It wasn't actually in Hilo. It was from Hilo going to one particular place. What place is that? It's the bucket list place.
Kilauea.
Yeah, Kilauea. So the first paved road on the Big Island, the first gravel road, and then the first paved road on the Big Island is from Hilo Harbor to Volcano. Volcano House is what's called. In fact, I think it's still called Volcano House on the side of the Kilauea. Not in Hilo town, that was still dirt roads. Not anywhere else in the island. Was literally from Hilo to the volcano, because if you were anyone visiting the Hawaiian Islands, you had to go to the volcano. And the way you did that is you went into the crappy but better harbor than the other ones, which was Hilo. So Hilo ends up being a place, which it wasn't prior to that. Hilo wasn't even a town prior to the 1840s, 1850s. But by the 1850s, 1860s, people get tired of going from Kealakekua Bay up to Kilauea, because it's a really long hike, and people don't want to spend that much time and energy, and it takes too long. So some genius comes up with the idea, well, if you go Hilo side, it's a better slope, it's a lot shorter, and you've got sort of a half-assed harbor there, so why don't you just come into here instead? And so Hilo actually becomes the only port on the Big Island, not because of what Hilo has, but because of access to Volcano. So in a weird way, Hilo starts up as the first probably tourist destination town on the Hawaiian Islands. in the mid-19th century, way before tourism becomes a deal anywhere else. I mean, Waikiki doesn't become a tourist destination for almost 80 years later. So Hilo starts up not because of itself, not even because of what's around it, but because of the need or the interest that people have in getting to the volcano. And so what you find is all those inter-island steamers, they go directly from Oahu. They usually stop at Lahaina, then they come over to Hilo. And then they go back the same way, Hilo, Lahaina, Honolulu, and that becomes the standard trip that you take. So this becomes tourism in the 19th, 20th century until, with airplanes in the 1960s, 70s. And even then they do the same thing. This is why Hilo had the international airport. Kailua Kona doesn't have an international airport till the late 70s. Hilo has one in the 1930s. Why? So people can fly into Hilo and then take a bus or a car or whatever up to the volcano and then go back to Hilo. Now, in that context, they're not paying any attention to any of the rest of the island. So not going to Waimea Town, they're not going to the north end, they're not going to South Point, they're not doing anything. It's Hilo volcano. That one line is the only thing of interest in the Big Island. So even when you do get people visiting the Big Island, they're not seeing, 95% of the island? And they're not interacting with 95% of the population. It's literally, it's a one-stop shop. It's like the 7-Eleven of tourism in the Hawaiian Islands, is the volcano, is it. So Hilo develops as the economic center just because of its location vis-a-vis folks that want to go to see a volcano. And Hilo becomes the only town in the Hawaiian Island, in the island of the Big Island, by the 1860s, 1870s. Now, ironically, if you ever go to Kailua Kona, you'll actually find that that actually has the original Hulehe'e Palace, which was the first built building in Western style for the Hawaiian government in the early part of the 19th century, is in Kailua Kona town. But the problem they had there was that by the 1830s, there was no one living here anymore. It was basically deserted. And what few people you have start clustering over here in the Hilo area, because that's where the only folks that are coming in, and that's where the only money is. Now, what that means then, if you're anyone else in the Big Island and you want to make any money, you either go to Hilo, or you have to figure out how to get your stuff to Hilo. So if you're the ranches, for example, you have to figure out how to drive your cattle over to Hilo, where then they're packed on boats and then shipped out. If you don't do that, you go to someplace like Kauai High and you literally throw them in the water and have the boats pick them up in the water, which in many cases kills the cows. So what that means is the rest of the island can't benefit from Hilo because Hilo was not a traditional location. It's not easily accessible from the rest of the island. It's only accessible for the folks that want to get to a volcano. Because it's the only town that's of interest outside of the Big Island, it very quickly becomes the economic hub of the Big Island. And in the territorial period, when you have the idea of counties in a more formal way, Hilo becomes the county seat, becomes the capital, if you would, of the Big Island County, because it's the only town left. All the rest of them are down to little tiny villages, I think, for a while. Can you guys still hear me?